Hey guys, thanks for tuning in today to Student Connection. And as you may have realized, summer is closing its door and school is about to start up. Students, I know you hate to hear that. Parents, you may hate to hear it, but more than likely you're like, I'm ready for school to get back in a routine for my kiddos. And everybody, we can kind of understand that. And as we do that, I know over the last couple of weeks, we've had different camps and we've had different stuff going on here. And so some of the videos we've missed a couple of weeks. But want to jump back in and over the next couple of weeks, look at some different things in a book. I've been reading this book. It's entitled Discover, Questioning Your Way to Faith. And it hits a lot of questions that, especially students, you may have dealing with faith. And parents, it's a great read, and the chapters are they're broken down really short in a way where it's understandable, whether you are a seventh grade student or you're an adult. Mike McGarry is the author, and he hits on some questions that are good. And moms and dads, as I've been reading through it, I'm thinking, man, I wish I could have read this 20 years ago and how to articulate what I'm feeling or talk about a certain topic. But it's been good. It's been good to read. I encourage you to pick it up. You can find it on Amazon. And it's something, moms and dads, you can read along with your students. If it's something that you have, one of your children questioning their faith or struggling through it, which there's times we're all going to do that. It's a great read. And tackles some good questions that our students face, and really our adults we face in our culture today. But he poses questions in a way that whether, like I said, you're a seventh grade student or you're an adult, you can find the answer in Scripture and points you to that. And it's a great resource. And like I said, over the next couple of weeks, we may not go chapter by chapter. We're going to jump around and hit some of the questions that he talks about that I think are good and are important in today's culture. But the first question in the book he asks is this, and I really appreciate this because he jumps straight into it, because Mike desires for the reader to have an understanding of who Jesus is and what he does. And so the first questions he asks is this: what is the gospel? Now, if you've been around me or listened to me or in our church, like that is at the heart of everything we do. And as believers, it should be. And so I want you to understand that. But he hits three things of questioning what is the gospel that from the eyes of a believer and way my mind processes it, they're really good, because he hits three things that are important. One, get the gospel clear, meaning we should have a clear understanding, but at the same time, we should be able to articulate it clear. We should be able to talk about it in a clear way as we're talking to people. And he points out three things that we cannot get around in understanding clear gospel. Is one, he says this, and it leads to number one. It says it's impossible to receive the gospel in faith without believing these three things. The first thing we have to believe is Jesus lived a sinless life. When we look through Scripture and see Jesus, how he lived his life, how he interacted with folks, how he answered questions, how he dealt with situations in his life, we see a person, a man that lived in a way that he never sinned on this earth. And so we can't get around that fact when it comes to the gospel. The second thing that we can't get around, we have to believe this in a clear gospel, and we have to understand it. We also have to explain it, is the atoning death of Jesus. How Jesus' death, his one death, paid for our sin and continues to pay for sin of those who put their faith and trust in him. And so not only did Jesus live a sinless life, in doing that, it enabled him to be that atoning sacrifice on our behalf, and what that looks like and what that means for each and every one of us. Because I understand when someone comes to faith in Jesus and they're a new believer, they may not fully get their mind around atonement, And to be honest, there's things that I still get my mind around. It still amazes me when I look into it and study it more. But as we grow with Christ, we should be able to discuss it and have some understanding and talk about it, and encourage one another in those conversations as we go along. And the third thing that we have to believe in understanding, have a clear understanding of the gospel, and have a clear explanation of the gospel when we take it out, is the victory we have in the resurrection of Jesus. And so in him rising from the dead, how our sin has been defeated, death has been defeated, and there's nothing that can hold us to the grave anymore because of that atoning sacrifice on the cross, that is perfect because of his sinless life. So it's kind of building blocks and how he states it there. And like I said, this is not a long drawn out a 30-minute read. He does it very well and very concise and very understandable. And so that's a good. To me, it's great about this book. I read back through it last night and just was highlighting and like, man, this is thinking to myself, he does this in such a good way. The second thing that he points out in posing the question, what is the gospel? So we have a clear understanding, and ultimately the clear understanding hinges on the importance of the gospel is who Jesus is and what he has done in that atoning work for us. All right, because the gospel centers around Jesus. He is the gospel, and that's one thing that in this book Mike really drives home is Jesus is the gospel. There's no other thing. It's not just it's a good idea, or it sounds real good. No, Jesus is the gospel, and through his work on the cross and rising from the grave, we can have that relationship with him. And then he points out, and I like how he does this, I guess because for me it's how I read it. As believers, we can misinterpret the gospel, and so he looks at two ways that we misunderstand the gospel. And the first one is this, and if you haven't experienced this, in my opinion, it's great, but you'll probably run into somebody like this in your life at some point where people will take the gospel and they want to cram it down your throat, like you need this, you have to have it, and that should be our desire. It should be our passion. That we desire for people to know the gospel and come to know Jesus, and understand his saving power. But he said it in one phrase, and I have it in my note here, is that when we cram the gospel down somebody's throat just repeatedly, if you think about that, and this may sound a little crass, a little rough, but anytime something's crammed down somebody's throat, they're going to regurgitate it. It's going to come back up. And so it's not going to be the best method in doing it. So as we have a clear understanding and clearly take it out, let us remember that. Let us deal with grace and love. And when we take the gospel out to people, understanding the importance of talking to them and telling them about the love and the sacrifice of Jesus and what he has done in that sacrifice. At the same time, if we sit there and force feed it, they're not going to listen to what we have to say, and that's all they're going to remember of how we handled it. On the flip side of that coin, as he puts it, we in our age and our culture now, we have a tendency to want to preach the gospel without words, and that is not the way the gospel's intended. There's many things we can do to live out a reflection of Jesus, but when it comes to an explanation of his love for us, we have a book of words to use. So I encourage you, as you are working through maybe how you get into a gospel conversation with your coworkers, moms and dads, or your friends at school, students, be prepared. It's okay to walk through it like at night. Hey, I'm gonna run through this, make sure I've got this down. I've got some scripture I can fall back on, because that will never fail you. But at the same time, run through it, like practice it. It's perfectly perfectly fine to do that. And in doing that, we develop that skill better. So if we're somebody who's intense and like, when you need to know this, and you have kind of that cram it down their throat mentality, God will soften that and use your passion, but learn how to shape that passion into a way where, not that it's palatable for people, because people are going to wrestle with the gospel, and they're going to have to, to use the same language, they're going to have to chew on it, they're going to have to work through it. But in how you deliver it, we can deliver it with grace, in a way where we're not trying to force people. Listen, we're just trying to tell you the good news of the gospel. But in doing that, using words, because the mentality behind preaching the gospel without words, it's almost like that we're pointing to ourselves. Just watch us, because we're the gospel, and we are not the gospel. Understand that. We cannot be the gospel, because the gospel is Jesus and what he's done. Now, his work through our life, we have encountered him, and we can tell the good news of the gospel, and we should. And that's how people come to know the Lord. Romans talks about how will people hear unless people are sent, and we talk to them. Scripture, it shows us here, how will they hear? Well, they will hear because we will talk. We will use words. So the whole mindset, and maybe you've heard that before. Well, I just need to live Jesus out. Well, living Jesus out means encountering people, speaking with him, and confronting them, because Jesus himself did that. And the last thing that he points out in asking the question, what is the gospel? The first, get the gospel clear. Understand that it can be misunderstood a couple different ways. But the last one is this: the gospel is for Christians too. And this hits home with me, because this hits one of my favorite chapters in the Bible. If you look at Philippians chapter 3, Paul talks about, my Bible says this, that it is good for him to preach the gospel, and it's good for us to hear it, because it is a safeguard for us. One, it reminds us of the saving power of Jesus that we should never get over and never get tired of hearing. But two, it holds us accountable and to the life we've surrendered, our life that we've surrendered to Jesus. And so understand that, because there's going to be times in our life where we're in a low time, and we need to be reminded of the goodness of God. And we have that through Jesus' sacrifice. And when Paul reminds us of that, the Apostle Paul reminds us here in chapter 3 of Philippians, it's good because we hear it preached. And then in this book, Mike kind of reminds the reader of that in three ways, and Paul does too. If you trickle down into Philippians chapter 3, he does it well, and that may have been Mike's motivation for this little part of the chapter. But we look at, when we come to know Jesus, we're justified in him, and our justification means we are our righteous standing before God. Through Christ's sacrifice, we are justified, and we can stand before God made righteous. And then he moves on to remind us also of our sanctification. As we are here, we are growing in the likeness of Jesus, or growing in holiness is the way he puts it in his book. And so once we come to a righteous standing of God, and we grow in our holiness of God, then he also reminds us of our glorification, of our coming perfection when we are in heaven. We are made whole and made complete, is probably a better word, made complete in Jesus Christ, when we are around the throne, honoring him and continuing giving him glory through all eternity. And when we have an understanding of these, because I think we should wrestle with some of this, and I think for us the biggest friction is in that sanctification. While we are here, growing in our holiness, how can we continue to do it, and do it well, and do it in a way not only where people see Jesus in us, because I believe our sanctification is a tool we can use that will lead us to a conversation, to use those words to tell people about Jesus, but also in a way, as we know one day that we will reach that glorification, we're going to be made perfect, made whole and complete in Jesus. And we need to understand that all three of these rely on our faith in who Jesus is and the grace that God has extended to us through Jesus. So it's nothing on our effort. It's nothing that we can do to establish to be justified, to be sanctified, and be glorified. It's not on us. It's all on Jesus. And when we surrender our lives to Him, we are taking up and saying, my faith is in Jesus. And in that faith, God has shown us grace and continues to show us grace because we are surrendered to Jesus and fall under His lordship, as I've said before. And so I really appreciate how this book is written. Like I said, how Mike puts the gospel first. In the first question, I'm like, he doesn't beat around the bush. He gets straight to it. So whoever is reading this is confronted with the question of what is the gospel? What do I believe? And he points everything back to Scripture, walks you through it. And so I encourage you, moms, dads, students even, pick up this book. Like I said, you can get it on Amazon. It's a great read and helps us kind of answer some questions along the way. Because and some of you may be there now to where you're struggling through some questions. Some of you, especially adults, you're like, man, I wish I would have had a better answer for this or a better resource for this 20 years ago when I was a teenager, or however many years ago it's been since you've been a teenager, and not fully understanding. This is a great resource. Pick it up. I encourage you to do that. And because that's kind of the overall premise of his book is helping you understand and walk through the struggle and questioning that. Not that questioning's wrong, it's not, but it points your questions back to Scripture in saying, here's the answer. Now, the wrestling part is between you and the Lord in the Scripture. And so, because it's not a fix-all book, and I don't think he would describe it that way. So I encourage you, like I said, pick that up. It's a great read, and we're going to tackle some more questions in the coming weeks with it. So look forward to being able to do that. I pray that the Lord use you where He has you, and you guys have a great week.